Good morning. Gotta wait for the cue from upstairs. Welcome this morning to Journey Church and Journey Church Online. If you're joining us online, let's pray while we get started. God, thank you for another day. And even though it's raining and a little bit overcast and a little bit cool this morning, thank you for the rain to give water to the earth and to help things grow and just for the seasons. And thank you for all you do. We know all you do is good. Be with us this morning, God, as we worship. Be with those who aren't here, those who are joining us online, and those who are still on their way. Just pray that we'd open our hearts to you this morning, and even though we're not all together in person, I pray that we'd be all together in spirit this morning, and that we would worship you together. In Jesus' name. Well, if you are here with us, let's stand together as we worship. Hope of all the nations, He is a light. He is a light for all the world to see. I feel the faith across the earth is rising. We prophesy about His kingdom coming, just like heaven all across the earth. He is a light shining in the darkness. He is a hope of all the nations. He is a light. He is a light for all the world to see. He is a light. He is a light shining in the darkness. He is a hope of all the nations. He is a light. He is a light for all the world to see. Great is the Lord. Great is the Lord. Praise His name. Praise His name. Great is the Lord. Praise His name. Praise His name. Great are you, Lord. Great is the Lord. Praise His name. Praise His name. Great is the Lord. Praise His name. Praise His name. He is a light shining in the darkness. He is a hope of all the nations. He is a light. He is a light for all the world to see. He is a light shining in the darkness. hope of all the nations. He is the light. He is the light for all the world to see. This world is not my home. I'm here but for a moment. It's all I've ever known. But this world is not my home. The fight is not my own. These burdens aren't my future. The empty tomb has shown I am bound for glory. I am free because I'm bound. I am bound for heaven's gates, where my feet will stand on holy ground. I am bound for glory. The saving hope is thine. Death is not my ending. My God has overcome. I am bound for glory. I am free because I'm bound. I am bound for heaven's gate, where my feet will stand on holy ground. I am bound for glory. Bound for glory. All my pain, hurt and shame, gone when Jesus calls my name. Endless joy, endless praise, all when Jesus calls my name. All my pain, hurt and shame, gone when Jesus calls my name. Endless joy, endless praise, all when Jesus calls my name. I am free because I'm bound. I am bound for heaven's gate, where my feet will stand on holy ground. I am bound for glory. I am free because I'm bound. I am bound for heaven's gate, where my feet will stand on holy ground. I am bound for glory. won't find me again. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. You turn mourning to dancing. You give beauty for ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You turn mourning to dancing. You turn beauty to ashes. You turn shame into glory. You're the only one who can. You turn graves into gardens. You turn bones into armies. You turn seas into highways. You're the only one who can. You're the only one who can. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you, Lord. There's nothing. Nothing is better than you. Oh, there's nothing better than you. There's nothing better than you. Oh, there's nothing. Nothing is better God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time. No point of reference, spoke to the dark and fleshed out the wonder of light. As you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. The stars were made to worship, so will I. I can see your heart in everything you've made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. silence, follow the sound of your voice. As you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you it all reveals your nature so alive. I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky, a canvas of glory. Creation still obeys you so alive. So stars are made to worship so mountains bow in reverence so alive. The oceans roar your greatness so alive. For if everything exists to lift you high, so alive. The wind knows where you send it so alive. If the rocks cry out in silence, so alive. If the sound of all our praises still runs dry, then we'll sing again 100 billion times. Oh, God of salvation, chase down my heart through all of my failures and pride. On a hill you created, light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. As you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. Where you lost your life so I could find it here. You left the grave behind you so alive. I can see your heart in everything you've done. Every part designed in the work of art called love. You gladly chose surrender so alive. See your heart in billion different ways. Every precious one, child you died to save. You gave your life to love them so alive. You would again 100 billion times. But what measure could amount to your design? The one who never leaves the one behind. us our sins, faithful and just to forgive us, to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Thank you that you give us the strength to walk in your freedom, to walk in repentance, and to leave sin behind. Thank you for your grace that flows through us into the people around us. Pray that we would carry that with us this week. That when people see us, they would see you. In our interactions, the people we work with, come in contact with, live with, that your grace would flow through us. That we'd see the world, and that we'd see each other. That we'd see others through your eyes, with your love. May we see. God, prepare our hearts this morning to hear from you. Give us ears to hear. Help our minds to understand what it is you're saying. Speak to our spirits this morning, God, and let us hear from you. In Jesus' name, amen.
The children, I guess, at this point can be dismissed. I don't know who's working with them today, but okay. I'd like to begin this morning by asking you a question. And this may seem like a very strange question to be asking in this context, but I think you'll see in a moment where I'm going with it. Do you believe in God? I think in a church building, I think the answer would be pretty much unanimous. But if you were to ask that same question out on the street, stop the first 100 people going by and ask them, you'd probably get all kinds of different responses and different ideas. Some would, well, I don't believe in God, just a big fairy tale in the sky kind of thing. They'd be very dismissive. Some would believe. But even the ones that believed would probably have a lot of very different ideas about what God was all about. Who is this God? And as you survey a number of people, they probably believe in a number of different gods, and some of them are quite different. And through the ages, philosophers have wrestled with the same issue. And in the end, you wind up at the same place, whether you believe in God or you don't. As you trace things back farther and farther, invariably you wind up with the existence of something that you cannot explain. I cannot explain God. He's beyond our comprehension, and I think anybody else who believes in a God would wind up at the same place. And the skeptics, they'll laugh, okay, where did God come from? As though that's some final dismissal. But really, when you come down to it, are they any better off? Do they have it any easier? Because if God didn't create everything that we see and experience, where did it all come from? Same question. When you trace it all the way back, there's something you just cannot explain. And for me, it just makes a whole lot more sense to have a guiding intelligence behind everything rather than just a bunch of inanimate matter that took it upon itself to exist in a very mindless fashion. But focusing in a little bit on those who accept the idea of a God, the question becomes, what kind of God do you believe in? You know, the Greeks and Romans had a whole society of gods. They had a god for everything. They had a god of agriculture. They had a god of the ocean. They had a god of war. They had a god of love. They had a god of this, that, and the other thing, a whole pantheon of gods that would, you know, presumably come to their aid in those specific situations. Other cultures have a more monotheistic idea of God, that, you know, there is a God, a single God in charge. But even there's still a bunch of variation in how they feel. Some see God as kind of a spiritual being. Others, you know, make for themselves some sort of idol out of wood or stone or metal. Some people's God is really an exalted human that, you know, rose to some level of enlightenment and then becomes a god. Somewhere in my archives at home, I have a magazine that I got a number of years ago from some cult that I won't name. But I don't know how they conceived of their God, but it was somebody kind of spiritual. And they knew that it's kind of hard to worship somebody that you can't see or handle. So they had created these little ceramic statuettes. They were blue. Kind of reminded me of ceramic Smurfs somehow. But beside the picture of them, they referred to them as worshipable deities. And so we can't see God, we can't comprehend God, but you can worship these little ceramics, and that's just as good. Well, God didn't like that idea, and that's why I think he was pretty put out about his people. Remember when Moses had gone up the mountain to receive the commandments, and he had been gone for a long time. And the people down below were getting rather restless. And, you know, where's God? We need a God. So Aaron gathered up all the jewelry that the people had, gold, and melted it down and manufactured this calf. And he said to the people, you know, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. Well, just think about that a little bit. That calf had just come into existence, and they'd been out of Egypt a month or so. How can that golden calf have brought anybody out of anywhere? It didn't make sense, and yet the people delighted in this because they had already kind of forsaken their God. Well, if we can't see God, what can we know about him? You know, Scripture tells us a lot. It says that, you know, God is holy, God is love, God is just. God said, you know, I am a jealous God. And, you know, we can find various attributes of God throughout Scripture. But also, the nature of God has been a study of theologians for centuries. And they have come up with a few what I call $5 words to characterize God. And I'd just like to unpack 3 of these for you here today to help us find out a little bit more about God. And I want to illustrate that with a look into the book of 2 Kings during the time of the prophet Elisha, because there's an incident there that kind of touches on all 3 of the words that I want to look at here. So what are these 3 words? Well, I'll give them to you now, and then we'll unpack them in a moment. But One of them is the word omniscient, which comes from omni, all, and skio, to know. So God is all-knowing. God is also omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. And God is omnipresent, which means he is everywhere. As we sang in the song, there's nowhere we can go that, God isn't there. So what does that mean in a practical instance? And let's look at the case from Elisha's history here. And just to set the stage, Syria, or some translations call it Aram because it was known by both names, but Aram was northeast of Israel, and they were at war with Israel. And the king of Syria was a fellow by the name of Ben-Hadad, and the king of Israel was Joram. And then, of course, we have Elisha, who was the prophet of God, and he was Joram's advisor. And then there's one more character in the drama, and that is Elisha's servant. We don't know his name, but so these four people are rather significant in this story. And Ben-Hadad had a strategy for trying to get at Israel. And his strategy was to enter the Israelite territory and set an ambush. So he'd bring his troops and put them into hiding and wait for Joram's army to go by. And once they were by, then they'd spring out from their hiding place and attack the Israelites. But there was a problem. Things didn't exactly go as he had planned. And he'd set his ambush, but nobody came. Well, that's strange. They always come this way. What's going on? But what Ben-Hadad had forgotten is that Jehovah was the God of Israel and that he is omniscient. He is all-knowing. So he knew what Ben-Hadad was up to. And let's read about this in 2 Kings, the 6th chapter. We'll start with verses 8 to 12. Now the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After conferring with his officers, he said, I will set up my camp in such and such a place. The man of God, this is Elisha, sent word to the king of Israel, beware of passing that place, because the Arameans are going down there. So the king of Israel checked on the place indicated by the man of God. Time and again, Elisha warned the king so that he was on his guard in such places. This enraged the king of Aram. He summoned his officers and demanded of them, will you not tell me which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? None of us, my lord the king, said one of his officers. But Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king of Israel your very words you speak in your bedroom. So here was Ben-Hadad making what he thought were secret plans, but none of his planning was a secret to God. We live and think in three dimensions. There's length, breadth, and height. And, we live in these dimensions. We can move forward and back. We can move side to side. We can move up and down. We have freedom. But physicists who like to develop equations to describe motion and momentum and, all these physical quantities, they've discovered something rather interesting. And that is that in many of the mathematical descriptions they've developed, time itself acts as almost a fourth dimension. And so we don't just have space and time as separate entities, and you've probably heard the phrase space-time continuum. Well, That's what that's all about. Space-time is sort of one thing as far as all these equations go. And as a result, God can move in all four of these dimensions, if you like. God can move ahead and back in time. And that's one limitation all these equations have, is that other dimensions can move independently, but time only goes in one direction. So, as a result, God knows how things will turn out. God knew what Ben-Hadad's plans would be. And so he communicated all this to Elisha. Now, we're not told how that happens. How did Elisha find out about God's plans? He might have seen it in a dream. He might have had a vision from God, a voice or some inner prompting. But however he came to know of that intelligence, he passed it on to King Joram. And then Joram took the appropriate action. He avoided that place, or he was ready for Ben-Hadad. And much to Ben-Hadad's chagrin, his plans never really worked out as he had hoped. And that underlies the point that nothing is hidden from God. He knows the future. He knows our future. And although it's hidden from us, because I think God realizes that too much knowledge is a dangerous thing, he wants us to take it moment by moment, because we couldn't handle it. That's reserved for somebody with the power and intelligence of God. But God is omniscient. God is also omnipotent, which means all-powerful. Now, once Ben-Hadad figured out, what's going on here? And he made some inquiries, and they said, well, Elisha, the prophet who is in Israel, tells the king the very words you speak in your bedroom. I mean, he knows all the thoughts of Ben-Hadad. So, in this case, he plans to deal with the problem. And he sends his forces to Dothan, which is the city where Elisha was living. And his plan was to take out Elisha. If we get rid of him, we get rid of the knowledge leak, and then we can have our way with the Israelite army. So let's read on a little bit further. Go, find out where he is, the king ordered, so I can send men and capture him. The report came back, he is in Dothan. Then he sent horses and chariots and a strong force there. They went by night and surrounded the city. When the servant of the man of God, that's Elisha's servant, got up and went out early the next morning, an army with horses and chariots had surrounded the city. "Oh, my Lord, what shall we do?" the servant asked. "Don't be afraid," the prophet answered. "Those who are with us are more than those who are with them." And that is the key, because God is all-powerful. "O Lord, what shall we do?" was the servant's question. And I confess I've asked myself that question sometimes too. You find yourself in a difficult situation. What am I going to do? How am I going to get by this? But the servant, and myself, and probably a lot of you too, only see the army of Ben-Hadad surrounding the city. And you look at that and say, oh, I'm totally outnumbered. I don't have a chance. So we don't want to be too hard on the servant, because, we've done the same thing. But what was Elisha's response to the servant? What is the advice for us? We may not face literal armies of horses and chariots surrounding us, but we all face problems of one kind or another. But what Elisha's servant didn't see, and what we ourselves sometimes overlook, is the factor of God in the equation. There's a song that we used to sing, greater is he that is in me, greater is he that is in me, greater is he that is in me than he that is in the world. It's just a reminder that, you can amass all the horses and chariots and armies that you want, but God is greater. And just as Roger spoke recently about, peace is not just freedom from war and riots and all that sort of thing. It's resting in the back of the boat. It's that calm assurance that we can have that however life seems to be going, we have the assurance that God is with us in that boat. And so, knowing that God is in control, Elisha said, don't be afraid. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Or as we might put it in, modern vernacular, God plus one equals a majority. You've probably seen that on bumper stickers or something somewhere along the line. That, if God is with us, or more accurately, if we're with God, we are the majority. And it's all about God, who is all-powerful. Nothing that the world can assemble can stand against the forces of God. Elisha recognized that power. The question is, do we? And the third word is omnipresent, which means that God is present everywhere. We can't escape from God. We can't avoid him. We can't hide from him. He sees us wherever we are. And Elisha realized that there's more going on than we can see in our dimensions. But he also recognized that the servant was going to need a little bit of convincing. So in the 17th verse we read, "And Elisha prayed, 'O Lord, open his eyes that he may see.' Then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha." So we may think we're being hung out to dry, that it's just us, what are we going to do? But God's armies are around us. We just can't always see them. I have a whimsical little book written by Edwin Abbott. It's kind of almost an Alice in Wonderland kind of thing. But it's called Flatland. And it's about a little imaginary world where instead of existing in 3 dimensions, the characters in that world only exist in 2 dimensions. So you can imagine a piece of paper or tabletop or something. You've got all these little squares and circles and triangles. And they're different shapes. That's how you tell them apart. But they can slide around on the plane, but they have no existence, no comprehension of a 3rd dimension. They're totally constrained to that plane. And so, if this were the plane, we could be above them and we could come closer and closer and closer and closer. But as long as we're even the tiniest little bit above that plane, they would have no awareness of us because they can't see into that 3rd dimension. And if we touched the plane, then suddenly, poof, something would appear in front of them and they would, see the 2-dimensional slice of our fingertip. And of course, that's all just whimsical, us just popping into existence, then we lift our finger, suddenly we're gone again. But, as I read that account of, the servant's eyes being opened and suddenly he sees all these chariots of fire and horses around them, did they just suddenly come there, or were they there all along? And maybe he just couldn't see into God's dimension. And when he opened his eyes and could suddenly see, then he could see it. Now, of course, this is all conjecture. It's just speculation. I'm not saying that's how God necessarily works, but I do believe personally that he does exist in a higher set of dimensions than we're aware of. And as a result, he can be very, very near to us all the time, and yet we may not physically be aware of him. We can't see him, we can't touch him, but he's always there. So all this is really just to say that we have to face up to the fact that we are limited, but God is not. And the other takeaway, of course, is that he loves us and is on our side, and we can trust him to use his knowledge, his power, his presence to our benefit. God is omniscient. He is all-knowing. Even though we may be frightened by the uncertainties of the future, he knows where things are going. And in today's clown world, that is important, because every day you just read another headline and you scratch your head. You know, these guys even know what they're talking about. They just, you know, today's headlines contradict yesterday's, and it just seems so confusing. But God is there. He knows, and his hand is steering. Robert Browning, who I admit is not one of my favorite poets, but because he tends to clomp along rather heavily, you know, just not very poetic, but he did write one poem, one stanza I like. It's called Rabbi Ben Ezra, and it starts off, "Grow old along with me, the best is yet to be, the last of life for which the first was made. Our times are in his hand, who saith, a whole I planned, youth shows but half, trust God, see all, nor be afraid." You know, our times are in his hand. We need not be afraid. God is all-powerful, omnipotent. Things may seem to be out of control, but never fear. God's got this. It may be too much for us. We wonder, you know, what can I do? I don't have the power. But we do have access to power. We have access to God through prayer. We can draw on his power to carry us through. And God is omnipresent, especially through his indwelling Spirit who lives within us to guide, to comfort, and to teach. And I'd like to just wrap up with a couple of scriptures from the Psalms. In the 46th Psalm, the first 3 verses says, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, and the mountains quake from their surging." I was reading something the other day, very timely, about COVID. And, you know, COVID has killed some people. But the ones who tend to die from COVID are those that have what they call comorbidities. These are other health conditions that are probably going to kill you before long anyway. But COVID just kind of hastens the departure. And you know what the number one comorbidity is? Obesity. You know, that puts a lot of strain on your heart and your lungs and everything, and then, you know, just throw COVID on top of that and you're in bad shape. But the number 2 comorbidity they're finding, and it's gaining rapidly on number 1, you know what that is? Fear. Fear. You know, we know a woman who told us that, you know, she's almost a basket case from fear. She's on antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, and she's just a mess. Doesn't know how she's going to handle things. And it's all just fear. And, you know, I imagine if she were to get a diagnosis, oh, you've got COVID, you know, that would be just the end of it. You know, that comorbidity would take her in a moment, because she's just so dwelling on fear all the time. But as the 23rd Psalm assures us, "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." We need not fear because our God is omniscient. Our God is omnipotent. Our God is omnipresent. And with Him in our lives, available to us to, if we but reach out to Him, we need not fear. Thank you.